Theo Graves was 40 years old when he decided to find out exactly what remained when he stripped away everything people might have stayed for. He drove a 4-year-old Chevrolet with a dent in the rear bumper he had not gotten around to fixing. He wore the same rotation of khakis to a job title his wife's friends found impossible to explain at dinner parties. Felicia called him steady. Her friends said low-key Theodore with a particular intonation that communicated they meant something other than a compliment. She smiled at it the same way she smiled at everything she had chosen not to address. On a Thursday in November, he came home and told Felicia that 3 of his major consulting contracts had ended simultaneously. He showed her a single page of numbers. He kept his voice level. He watched her face process what he had told her, and he noted exactly what he saw. 17 days later, her bags were in the back of her Lexus, and Kevin Ashworth's name was on her phone screen while she stood in the driveway deciding what else to take. Over the preceding 14 months, $23,000 had moved out of their joint accounts into a private account bearing only her name, in careful increments she had made while the marriage was still supposed to mean something. What Felicia did not know, what Kevin Ashworth did not know, what the friends who stopped returning calls after week 3 did not know, was what the Graves Risk Holdings accounts contained, and whose name was on every single one of them. Every person in Theo Graves' life departed within 30 days of his manufactured collapse. Every person except an 8-year-old black Labrador named Duke, who could not read a balance sheet and did not care to, and who showed up at the foot of his bed every single morning without being asked. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The morning he made the decision, 2 full weeks before he said anything to Felicia, Theo had been at the kitchen table before sunrise with Duke at his feet, and a cup of coffee he had not yet started drinking, in the specific kind of silence that collects around a question that has been forming long enough to finally be ready. Duke was 8 years old and black as a good suit, and had been with Theo since the year his mother died. When a friend from graduate school had arrived at his door with a 12-week-old Labrador puppy and said, "This is not a solution, but it is something." Duke had grown from that puppy into a dog of considerable quiet dignity, and he had never asked Theo for anything beyond a walk and a bowl and the occasional ear scratch, which put him ahead of several people Theo could name without effort. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial in Westwood, Cincinnati, that Theo had purchased 6 years into the marriage, the down payment drawn from his Graves Risk Holdings distributions without explanation. Felicia had decorated it and called it theirs, and hosted dinners in it with the ease of someone who understood how to make a house perform its function well. It was a good house. He had believed, for a long time, that what was inside it matched the quality of what surrounded it. He had been revising that belief for 2 years. His mother, Gloria Graves, had cleaned other people's houses for 12 years after his father left, and had raised Theo and his younger brother in a rental on the west side of Cincinnati, with the specific pride of a woman who refused to allow circumstances to become identity. What a man builds in the quiet, she had told Theo when he was 16 and mortified by their address, is the only thing that lasts. Everything else is performance. She had died 4 years ago, before she could see what the quiet had produced, and that was the one thing about his success that his success could not address. On the end of the guest room bed, Felicia had placed a set of decorative pillows from an expensive home goods store she preferred, and had folded his mother's quilt. A queen-sized piece Gloria had made by hand over 2 winters from scraps of old shirts and curtains, and a deep blue fabric whose origin Theo had never been able to identify, and moved it to the foot of the bed. It had been folded there for 2 years. He had not said anything about it. The trigger had been a Sunday afternoon 3 weeks before the decision. He had been in the home office working through a Graves Risk Holdings quarterly summary when Felicia came in to get something from the shelf. Her phone was on speaker. He heard her friend ask, "But are you actually happy?" He heard Felicia's pause, 3 full seconds. Then he heard her say, "He's fine. Everything about him is just fine. I don't know if fine is enough anymore." There was a sound in the background, a voice he did not recognize, low, then her laugh. The one she used when she was comfortable and not performing. Felicia took what she came for from the shelf and left without looking at him. He sat at the desk for a long time. Duke came in and lay down across his feet. His second phone, the work line registered to Graves Risk Holdings, known to his partner Vincent and his attorney Claudette Marsh and his uncle Reggie, and to no one else in that house, sat in the jacket hanging on the hook behind the door. She had walked past that jacket for 6 years. She had never once looked at what was in the pocket. He had met Felicia at a networking event when he was 31. She was in marketing for a financial services firm, and she was sharp and well-prepared and funny in the way of people who had worked at it long enough for it to become genuine. She asked good questions about risk and remembered the answers 2 weeks later when she texted him, which told him she had been paying attention, and that quality had undone him. They married 3 years later. He had been happy in the marriage for longer than the marriage had actually been good, which was the specific form of denial that only becomes readable in retrospect. He waited until Duke was settled, poured a second cup of coffee, and called his uncle Reggie. Reggie listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "So find out." 3 words. They were enough. Some questions, once they had been asked out loud, had already answered themselves. The manufactured collapse had been planned with the precision Theo applied to every serious risk assessment, specific enough to be credible, controlled enough not to be traceable. He had worked through the structure with Claudette first, moved the distribution accounts behind an additional holding layer, adjusted what appeared on any jointly accessible document, prepared the narrative of the fictional cascade with the care of a man who had spent 15 years evaluating exactly what failed and why. He told Felicia on a Thursday evening after dinner, at the kitchen table, with his hands folded and his voice level. 3 major contracts gone simultaneously. An acquisition that had ended all consulting arrangements overnight. He showed her the single page of numbers. She had asked 2 questions. Both were about their monthly expenses. She had not asked how he was doing. He had not slept well that night. Duke stayed at the foot of the bed and breathed with the even patience of a creature who required nothing beyond what was already present. By the end of the 2nd week, she was arriving home later. By the 3rd week, Kevin Ashworth's name had come up in 2 separate contexts, once in a call she took in the back hallway with the door not quite closed, and once when she mentioned needing to handle something at the office for a colleague. By day 17, her bags were in the Lexus, and she was in the driveway making decisions about what to take, and his name was on her screen in a text that began lowercase. She said, at the car door, "I'm sorry, I can't do this." He stood on the porch and watched her go. Duke sat beside him and watched too. The documentation came in the weeks that followed. His hands didn't shake. His face remained perfectly calm. He pulled 3 years of joint account records and built the full transfer timeline. 22 transactions across 14 months, amounts between $400 and $2,200, directed to an account that had not appeared on any financial disclosure she had ever provided. Total, $23,000. He documented every line in a clean spreadsheet and cross-referenced the transfer dates against his own travel records. 19 of the 22 transfers had been made on days when he was confirmed out of town. Then he found the folder. a shared cloud account they had both used 2 years prior for a vacation they had ultimately not taken, a login he had maintained without thinking much about it, a folder she had not remembered they shared. Inside it, an email thread between Felicia and a Cincinnati family law attorney. The first email was dated 6 months before his manufactured financial collapse. The thread contained a preliminary consultation, questions about asset division, a note about what she might reasonably expect as the initiating party. She had not left because he appeared to have nothing. She had been planning to leave for 6 months. The collapse had simply removed her last reason to stay. She had no idea, across those 6 months of planning and 14 months of quiet transfers, that the man she had been preparing to leave had been watching with the same methodical attention he brought to every actuarial table he had ever evaluated, and had calculated every condition before making a single visible move. He photographed every page, forwarded everything to Claudette's encrypted account, and opened a new folder on his desktop. He named it Felicia. Duke came into the office, turned one circle, and lay down at his feet. He had always known what was worth staying for. Claudette Marsh had practiced family and business law in Cincinnati for 26 years. Her office on 5th Street was the kind of room where serious conclusions arrived without requiring anyone to raise their voice. She reviewed everything across 90 minutes and a full legal pad of notes, and looked up only when she was done. The Graves Risk Holdings equity is protected in full under the prenuptial agreement you signed 8 years ago, she said. The holding structure predates the marriage. The $23,000 in transfers is documented marital waste and will be incorporated into the settlement calculation. The preliminary attorney consultation she conducted 6 months prior establishes that the divorce was premeditated, which affects the framing of several claims her attorney may attempt. She set down her pen. You have been thorough. Her attorney is going to have a difficult morning. She paused. How are you? He considered the question the way he considered every question that deserved an honest answer. I'm clear, he said. That's different from fine. A good underwriter, he had always believed, never finalized a policy without full disclosure. He had simply needed the complete picture before he could move. 2 days later, Theo drove to Dayton to see his uncle Reggie, who was 68 years old and had driven regional routes for a living for 30 years, before retiring to a house he owned outright and a garden he kept with the same unhurried consistency he had brought to everything in his life. He had been at Gloria's funeral in the front pew. He was the only family member who had ever asked about Theo's work with genuine curiosity, not about the money, but about the structure of it, the reasoning behind it, the way it was built. Reggie listened to everything at the kitchen table without interrupting. When Theo finished, Reggie looked at his hands for a moment. I watched you build that company for 12 years in rooms nobody was paying attention to, he said. I always knew you were doing something worth doing. The question was always whether she'd ever look. He met Theo's eyes directly. She didn't. But that's her answer, not yours. He leaned back in the chair. Your mother used to say, you can't teach loyalty and you can't purchase it. It's already there before the test arrives, or it isn't there at all. The test just tells you which. He looked at his nephew. You ran the test. Now you know. Theo drove back through the dark with that settled exactly where it needed to be. Leon Pratt, the investigator Claudette had worked with for 14 years, delivered his preliminary report on Kevin Ashworth that Thursday, marketing director at Felicia's firm. Prior to that role, a position at a company in Columbus that had ended with an internal HR complaint by a female colleague, handled quietly. No external record. His name appeared in Felicia's work calendar 14 times across the previous 5 months, labeled as strategy review and project alignment. Leon had confirmed, through a front desk contact at the building, that Felicia and Kevin had been seen together in the parking structure on 3 occasions within the period Theo had documented. He added the report to the folder. That Wednesday, Felicia called about the joint car insurance. She was composed and businesslike, speaking in the tone of someone who had made a clean exit and expected a clean process. He answered in the same register, level, cooperative, nothing volunteered that had not been asked for. She said her attorney would be in touch. He said he understood. She said she hoped they could handle this without it becoming complicated. He said he was sure they could work toward what was fair. He was sitting in front of the Graves Risk Holdings quarterly summary when she called. Duke was asleep on the rug behind his chair. Some systems, he thought, ran most efficiently when no one was watching them run. The settlement meeting was at Claudette's office on a Tuesday morning in January. Felicia's attorney, a capable practitioner named Rourke, who carried the composed certainty of someone expecting a manageable negotiation, arrived with Felicia and settled across the conference table. He had prepared a preliminary asset estimate. He had not been given the complete picture by his client. Claudette opened her portfolio without preamble. The Graves Risk Holdings documentation came first. The holding company structure, its 15-year operating history, the equity position, the current valuation summary. She placed the balance sheet face up on the table. Total equity value, $3.1 million. Preliminary acquisition discussions with a regional insurance consortium, noted in a bracketed line at the bottom. She placed the prenuptial agreement beside it. Every Graves Risk Holdings asset, protected in full, established before the marriage, outside the reach of this proceeding. Then, the joint account transfer records. 22 transactions, 14 months, $23,000, each date, each amount, the receiving account number bearing Felicia's name alone. Then the email thread, 6 months prior. The preliminary divorce consultation. The questions about asset division as the initiating party. The date stamp in the header, which predated Theo's manufactured financial collapse by 183 days. Rourke looked at the email thread. He looked at Felicia. He set his own preliminary estimate face down. Claudette folded her hands. The Graves Risk Holdings equity is not marital property and is not subject to this proceeding, she said. The joint account transfers represent documented marital waste incorporated into the settlement calculation. The prenuptial agreement governs the remaining marital assets, and we are prepared to settle on fair terms within its provisions. She looked across the table without heat. What your client was reaching for was never in range. What she is entitled to, we are prepared to discuss today. She had no idea. Not the Thursday evening she listened to his carefully prepared explanation of a manufactured collapse. Not the 6 months before it when she had been consulting attorneys and moving money in the certainty that she understood exactly what she was doing. That the man she had determined was simply fine had spent 15 years building something worth $3, $1 million in rooms she had never once thought to look into. Felicia looked at the balance sheet. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Theo, who sat at the end of the table with his hands folded and his face arranged in the expression of a man who had run the full assessment and was looking at the completed results. "You knew," she said. Not a question. He looked at her without anger and without satisfaction and without anything that would have made the moment into something it did not need to be. A good underwriter never finalizes a policy without full disclosure, he said. I needed to know what I was actually insuring. He stood. He picked up his portfolio. You answered the question. Everyone answered the question. He looked at her once more, clearly, and without cruelty, and without hesitation. Then he left. 9 months passed. The Westwood house was quieter and better for it. He had repainted the guest room and moved his mother's quilt to the foot of his own bed, where it sat against the dark comforter with the specific rightness of something returned to where it had always belonged. He had moved Duke's bed from the doorway to the corner by the bedroom window, where the morning light came in first and longest. Graves Risk Holdings finalized its acquisition agreement with the Regional Insurance Consortium in April, a transaction valued at $3.4 million, with Theo remaining as principal consultant through the transition period. Vincent sent a bottle of good scotch. Theo set it on the shelf and told him they would open it when the ink was completely dry. The ink dried in June. They opened it over a video call from their respective cities and toasted the thing they had built in the rooms nobody had been watching. Brianna had come through the dog park on a Saturday morning in March, which was the kind of origin Theo would have found too simple to believe if he had not been standing in it. She crouched down and offered her hand to Duke before she had looked up at Theo, which he noted immediately. Duke accepted the greeting with his characteristic dignity, and then leaned against her knee, which he did not do with people he had not already decided about. She laughed and said, "I think he's decided about me." Theo said, "He has good judgment." She said, "So do I usually." She asked good questions and did not perform for him, and told him difficult things plainly, and held positions she had arrived at through experience rather than convenience. On an evening in May, she was in the kitchen of the Westwood house making tea, and she looked through the doorway at his mother's quilt on the bed and asked about it. He told her about Gloria, the rental on the west side, the houses she cleaned, the quilt made from scraps, the specific blue fabric whose origin he had never traced. She listened to all of it without trying to make it into something easier than it was, and that quality, small and real, was the thing that told him she was something he had not expected to find and was not going to dismiss. Felicia and Kevin Ashworth were together in Blue Ash. The settlement had been calculated to the prenuptial terms and the documented waste. She had her personal accounts, her vehicle, the furniture she had moved to storage when she left the house. Kevin Ashworth had been placed on administrative leave at the firm for a conduct matter being handled internally. Theo had heard about it once and had not followed it after that. It was not his story to carry. His brother had called once during the collapse, 3 weeks in, briefly. He had called again in April after reading the acquisition announcement in a trade publication. Theo had let that call go to voicemail. He had listened to the message. He had decided what it was worth and had not called back. On a Saturday morning in September, Theo sat on the back porch of the Westwood house with his coffee in both hands, and Duke beside him in the low early light, both of them looking at the yard the way they had looked at things together for 8 years, without needing the moment to perform, without needing it to be more than what it was. The quilt was on the bed. The house was his. The work had been done. He had run the assessment. He had the full disclosure. Some risks could only be evaluated by changing the conditions and observing what held. He had changed the conditions. He had seen exactly what held. Duke put his head on Theo's knee. Some answers did not need words. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.